Sarah Mitchell stood in line at the military recruitment office, her worn sneakers squeaking against the polished floor. The 42-year-old woman clutched a crumpled application in her sweaty palm, surrounded by teenagers half her age who looked like they could bench press her entire body weight. She didn't belong here. Everyone could see it, especially Drill Sergeant Rodriguez, who was about to make the biggest mistake of his 20-year military career. What happened next would leave an entire training facility speechless and force a decorated sergeant to question everything he thought he knew about strength, courage, and the quiet woman standing before him. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah Mitchell had always been invisible. At least, that's how it felt as she navigated the crowded streets of downtown Phoenix, Arizona on that sweltering Tuesday morning in late September. Her faded blue jeans hung loose on her small frame, and her oversized gray sweater seemed to swallow her whole despite the desert heat. She kept her dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, no makeup, no jewelry except for a thin silver chain that disappeared beneath her collar. To anyone passing by, she looked like just another middle-aged woman running errands, maybe a grocery store clerk on her day off, or a single mother trying to make ends meet. The kind of person you'd glance at once and forget immediately. Sarah had cultivated this appearance carefully over the past 8 years, and it had served her well. She stopped at the crosswalk, waiting for the light to change, and pulled out her phone to check the time. 10:47 a.m. She had 13 minutes to make it to her appointment at the Department of Veterans Affairs. Her monthly check-in with Dr. Williams, the therapist who helped her navigate what the VA called readjustment challenges, what Sarah privately called the aftermath of a life she could never talk about. The light changed and she crossed with the crowd, her steps measured and deliberate. Everything about Sarah was measured and deliberate, from the way she held her shoulders to the careful neutrality of her expression. 8 years of practice had made it second nature. Her apartment was a 10-minute walk from the VA office, located in a modest complex on the outskirts of the city. The rent was reasonable, the neighbors minded their own business, and most importantly, it was the kind of place where nobody asked too many questions. Sarah had lived there for 3 years, ever since she'd left her previous life in Colorado. Before that, she'd been in North Carolina for 2 years. Before that, Oregon. She moved every few years, never staying long enough to form real connections, never settling deep enough to risk exposure. The apartment itself reflected this temporary existence. Sparse furniture, mostly secondhand, a small couch, a coffee table, a television she rarely watched. The kitchen held the basics, a few plates, some mismatched cups, a coffee maker that had seen better days. The bedroom contained a bed, a dresser, and a closet that held her simple wardrobe of jeans, sweaters, and sneakers. Everything she owned could fit in the back of her Honda Civic just in case she needed to leave quickly. There were only 2 things in the apartment that hinted at something more complex beneath Sarah's plain exterior. The first was a small wooden box hidden in the back of her bedroom closet, containing documents with names that weren't Sarah Mitchell and photographs of a woman who looked like her but carried herself differently. The second was her morning routine. Every day, without fail, Sarah woke at 500 hours. She'd catch herself using military time and mentally correct it to 5 a.m., but the habit persisted. She would spend exactly 45 minutes in what appeared to be yoga and stretching, but any trained observer would recognize the movements as tactical conditioning exercises. Maintaining flexibility, core strength, reaction time. Then came 30 minutes of what looked like meditation, but was actually a mental exercise regime designed to keep certain skills sharp. Memory palace techniques, situational awareness drills, emotional regulation protocols. Sarah worked part-time at a local hardware store called Murphy's Tools and More. It was perfect cover, manual labor that kept her in shape, interaction with customers that required minimal personal disclosure, and the kind of job that matched her carefully constructed persona. Her manager, Bill Murphy, was a gruff 60-year-old who appreciated employees who showed up on time and didn't cause drama. Sarah was his favorite worker, though he'd never admit it. "Mitchell," Bill would call out when she arrived each morning at 7 a.m., "loading dock needs organizing. Those idiots from the night shift can't tell a Phillips head from a flathead." Sarah would nod and get to work, moving boxes that made younger employees grunt with effort, operating machinery with an efficiency that impressed even the old-timers. She had a gift for fixing things that seemed broken beyond repair, whether it was a customer's antique drill or the store's temperamental forklift. Her hands were steady, her troubleshooting methodical, and she never got flustered under pressure. The customers loved her too, though they probably couldn't explain why. There was something calming about Sarah's presence. When frustrated contractors came in looking for specific parts, or when overwhelmed homeowners needed help with their weekend projects, Sarah had a way of assessing their needs quickly and providing exactly what they required. She listened more than she spoke, asked precise questions, and never made anyone feel stupid for not knowing the difference between a lag bolt and a carriage bolt. "That woman's got more sense in her pinky finger than most people have in their whole head," Mrs. Patterson, a regular customer, had told Bill once. Mrs. Patterson was a retired teacher who'd been renovating her kitchen for 6 months, and Sarah had guided her through every step of the process. What Mrs. Patterson didn't know was that Sarah's expertise came from 8 years of maintaining and repairing equipment in some of the most demanding environments on Earth, or that her calm demeanor under pressure had been forged in situations where a wrong move meant death, or that the steady hands that helped customers pick out the right screws had once performed field surgery in a bombed-out building in Syria. Sarah's evenings followed the same routine. She'd return to her apartment, prepare a simple dinner, and spend exactly 1 hour reading. Not novels or magazines, but technical manuals, news reports from specific regions of the world, and medical journals. Information that helped her maintain skills she hoped she'd never need again, but couldn't afford to lose. She had no social media accounts, no dating apps, no close friends. The loneliness was a constant ache, but it was safer this way. Safer for everyone. The only variation in Sarah's routine came on the 3rd Tuesday of every month when she walked to the VA office for her appointment with Dr. Williams. These sessions were part of her agreement with the government, a condition of her new identity, and the monthly stipend that supplemented her hardware store wages. She would sit in the sterile office, answer questions about her sleep patterns and stress levels, and carefully navigate around the topics she could never discuss. Dr. Williams was a kind woman in her 50s who specialized in helping veterans transition to civilian life. She'd been seeing Sarah for 3 years and had never gotten a straight answer about her military service. Sarah's file was heavily redacted, marked with classifications that Dr. Williams didn't have clearance to access. All she knew was that Sarah had served with distinction in multiple overseas operations and was dealing with what the file euphemistically called career-related trauma. "How are you sleeping, Sarah?" Dr. Williams would ask during their sessions. "Fine, 6 to 7 hours most nights." "Any nightmares?" "Occasionally, nothing I can't handle." "Are you making any social connections? Friends at work, perhaps?" "I prefer to keep to myself." It was always the same careful dance, Sarah providing just enough information to satisfy the requirements while revealing nothing that mattered. Dr. Williams suspected there was much more beneath the surface, but she also understood that some stories were too dangerous to tell. What Dr. Williams didn't know was that Sarah's real name was Colonel Sarah Mitchell, callsign Ghost, former commander of the Army's most classified Special Operations Unit. What she didn't know was that Sarah had spent 15 years moving through hostile territory where a single mistake would have sparked international incidents. What she didn't know was that the quiet woman sitting across from her had been responsible for operations that would never appear in any history book but had potentially saved thousands of lives. And what Dr. Williams definitely didn't know, that in exactly 4 days, Sarah's carefully constructed ordinary life was about to collide with her extraordinary past in a way that would change everything. 4 days later, Sarah's world shifted on its axis with a single phone call. She was restocking paintbrushes at Murphy's Tools when her phone buzzed in her back pocket. The number was blocked, but Sarah recognized the specific pattern of rings. 2 short, 1 long, 2 short. It was a code she hadn't heard in 8 years, one that made her blood freeze in her veins. "Excuse me," she told the customer she'd been helping, stepping quickly toward the stockroom. Her hands were steady as she answered, but her heart hammered against her ribs. "Hardware store, Sarah speaking," she said, maintaining her cover even though she knew exactly who was calling. "Ghost." The voice was gravelly, familiar. "Director Harrison from the CIA's Special Activities Division. We have a situation." Sarah closed the stockroom door behind her, checking to ensure she was alone. "I'm retired, sir. You know that." "Retirement's over. Agent Rodriguez has gone dark in Kandahar. Last communication was 72 hours ago. He was carrying intelligence about a planned terrorist attack on domestic soil. We need you to extract him." Rodriguez. Sarah's chest tightened. Miguel Rodriguez had been her second in command for 5 years, a brilliant operative who'd saved her life more times than she could count. If he was in trouble, "Send someone else," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "There is no one else with your skill set who knows the terrain and has Rodriguez's trust. Sarah, if that intelligence falls into the wrong hands, we're looking at another 9/11, maybe worse." The silence stretched between them. Sarah stared at a shelf of screwdrivers, seeing instead the dusty streets of Kandahar, the compound where she'd spent 18 months building a network of assets, the place where she'd earned her call sign by moving through enemy territory like a ghost, invisible until she struck. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "The terms of my retirement are suspended under Article 7 of your service agreement, national security threat, immediate recall authorization. You know this, Colonel." Colonel. He'd used her real rank. Sarah's civilian persona felt like a costume that was suddenly too tight. "I need 48 hours to arrange." "You have 12. There's a military transport leaving Phoenix Sky Harbor at 800 tomorrow. A cover story has been prepared. You're Sarah Mitchell, defense contractor consultant, conducting routine equipment evaluations. Your credentials are being uploaded to your secure account now." Sarah pressed her palm against the cool metal of the storage shelf. 8 years of carefully constructed normalcy, gone in a single phone call. "And if I refuse? Then Rodriguez dies, thousands of innocent Americans die, and you live with that knowledge for the rest of your very short retirement. Because the next attack won't be the last attack, and we both know you'll never forgive yourself for walking away when you could have made a difference." He was right. Damn him, but he was right. Equipment package? Standard loadout plus specialized gear for desert ops. You'll be briefed on the transport. Extraction timeline? 7 days maximum. In and out, ghost. Just like old times. But it wasn't like old times, and they both knew it. Sarah was 8 years older, 8 years softer. She'd been living as a hardware store clerk, not maintaining combat readiness. "Understood," she said anyway. "Ghost?" Harrison's voice carried a note of something that might have been affection. "It's good to have you back." The line went dead. Sarah stood in the stockroom for a full minute, processing the implications. Then she walked back onto the sales floor, finished helping her customer, and completed her shift as if nothing had happened. But inside, Colonel Sarah Mitchell was awakening from 8 years of dormancy. That evening, Sarah sat in her apartment staring at the wooden box from her closet. Inside were 3 passports with different names, $5,000 in various currencies, and a photograph of her old team. Rodriguez was in the center, grinning at the camera, with his arm around Sarah's shoulders. They'd just completed a mission in Somalia, and everyone was still high on adrenaline and relief. Also in the box was her service weapon, a Sig Sauer P226 that had saved her life more times than she could count. She hadn't touched it in 8 years, but when she picked it up now, her hand remembered the weight, the balance, the way her finger naturally found the trigger guard. Muscle memory from another lifetime. Her laptop chimed with an encrypted message. The cover story, as promised. Sarah Mitchell, defense contractor, specializing in weapons systems evaluation for desert environments. It was good work, the kind of detailed background that would hold up under scrutiny. Someone had spent considerable time and resources preparing this identity. She spent the night making preparations. Her few personal belongings went into a storage unit she'd rent under a false name. A letter of resignation went to Bill Murphy, citing a family emergency. Her VA appointment was canceled. Every trace of Sarah Mitchell's ordinary life was carefully erased or suspended. The hardest part was the call to Dr. Williams. "Sarah, this is unexpected. Our appointment isn't until next week. I have to leave town, family emergency. I'm not sure when I'll be back." Dr. Williams was quiet for a moment. "Is everything all right? You sound different." Different because Sarah was already shifting back into Colonel Mitchell, and the transformation was audible in her voice. More confident, more direct, more command presence bleeding through. "Everything's fine. I'll contact you when I return." "Sarah, wait. If you're in some kind of trouble—" "I'm not in trouble, doctor. Thank you for everything." She hung up before Dr. Williams could probe further. The therapist would file a report, note the abrupt departure, but there was nothing she could do. By the time anyone came looking for Sarah Mitchell, Colonel Mitchell would be halfway around the world. At 0600 hours, Sarah was dressed in khaki pants, a button-down shirt, and hiking boots, the uniform of a civilian contractor. Her hair was pulled back in a professional bun, and she carried a laptop bag that contained more than electronics. To anyone watching, she looked like a businesswoman heading to the airport. But as she drove towards Sky Harbor, something was bothering her. The timing was too convenient. Rodriguez went dark just as a domestic terror threat emerged. Harrison's urgency, the way he'd used her real rank, as if he knew exactly which psychological buttons to push. Sarah had spent 15 years in intelligence. She knew how manipulation worked, how assets were activated and controlled. And she was starting to suspect that this emergency might be more orchestrated than spontaneous. The military transport was exactly where Harrison had said it would be, hidden in a restricted section of the airport that civilians never saw. A C-130 Hercules, painted in neutral colors with minimal markings. The pilot was Air Force, young and professional, who checked her credentials without making conversation. "Ma'am, you're cleared for immediate departure. Flight time to Kandahar is approximately 14 hours, with one refueling stop in Germany." Sarah nodded and climbed aboard. The cargo hold had been fitted with a few passenger seats and a briefing area. She was the only passenger, which meant this entire operation was for her alone. Expensive. Very expensive. As the plane taxied toward the runway, Sarah opened the briefing packet Harrison had mentioned. Rodriguez's last known location was a compound outside Kandahar that she knew well, too well. It was the same compound where she'd conducted her final mission 8 years ago, the operation that had gone wrong and forced her retirement. The coincidences were piling up. Rodriguez in that specific location, a domestic terror threat that required her exact skill set, the urgency that prevented proper mission planning. Sarah had learned to trust her instincts, and right now, they were screaming that something was wrong. But Rodriguez was still out there, possibly captured, possibly dead. And if there really was a terror plot threatening American lives— She settled back in her seat as the plane lifted off, watching Phoenix disappear beneath the clouds. Whatever game Harrison was playing, whatever secrets he wasn't telling her, she'll figure it out once she was on the ground. She always did. But as the hours passed and the transport flew eastward, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking into a trap. Not just for her, but for everyone involved. The question was whether Harrison was setting the trap, or whether they were all walking into one together. She'd find out soon enough. The last time Sarah had been in Afghanistan, she'd been evacuated under cover of darkness after a mission went catastrophically wrong. She'd sworn never to return. Now, 8 years later, she was heading back to the same region for the same type of operation to save a man who'd been there when everything fell apart. History had a cruel sense of irony. As the transport crossed into international airspace, Sarah began her mental preparation. She visualized the compound, the surrounding terrain, the likely scenarios she'd face. She reviewed Arabic phrases she hadn't used in years, tactical procedures that had kept her alive in hostile territory. Slowly, methodically, Sarah Mitchell, the hardware store clerk, disappeared entirely. In her place sat Colonel Sarah Mitchell, call sign Ghost, one of the most effective special operations commanders in U.S. military history. She was going home. The Kandahar heat hit Sarah like a physical wall as she stepped off the transport. Even at 600 hours, the temperature was already climbing toward what would be another brutal day in the Afghan desert. The familiar smell of dust, diesel fuel, and something indefinable that she'd always associated with war zones filled her nostrils. Bagram Airfield had changed in the 8 years since she'd last been here. More permanent structures, better roads, but the same underlying tension that came with being in hostile territory. Sarah kept her expression neutral as she was escorted to a temporary briefing facility, but internally she was cataloging everything: guard positions, vehicle placements, the subtle body language of soldiers who'd been in country too long. Major David Chen was waiting for her in a prefab building that served as the intelligence hub. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe 35, with the kind of intense focus that came from running operations in a combat zone. His handshake was firm, his eyes sharp as they assessed her. "Ms. Mitchell, I'm Major Chen, your liaison for this operation. I understand you have extensive experience in this region." Sarah nodded. Her cover identity held classified consultant credentials that would explain her knowledge without revealing her true background. "I've worked here before. What's the current situation with Agent Rodriguez?" Chen spread a map across the table. Red circles marked known hostile positions, blue indicated friendly forces, and a yellow X showed Rodriguez's last known location. The compound was 15 kilometers outside Kandahar, in territory that officially belonged to the Afghan government, but was effectively controlled by a coalition of Taliban and foreign fighters. Rodriguez was investigating reports of a new weapons cache when he went dark. His last transmission was a coded message indicating he'd found something significant, but then nothing. No emergency beacon, no follow-up communication. Sarah studied the map. The compound was built into a hillside, with multiple escape routes and excellent sightlines in all directions. It was the kind of place you chose when you wanted to see enemies coming from far away, or when you wanted to disappear quickly if things went wrong. What assets do we have for extraction? Limited. This is officially a reconnaissance mission only. You'll have basic equipment, a local guide, and emergency extraction available if you can reach the primary LZ. Chen pointed to a spot 3 kilometers from the compound. But Sarah, Ms. Mitchell, Command has made it clear that this cannot become an international incident. You're going in the dark. Dark. No backup, no air support, no official recognition if something went wrong. Sarah had run dozens of dark operations, but they never got easier. The guide? Jamal Naziri, former Afghan Army, been working with us for 2 years. He knows the terrain and has contacts in the area. Chen led her to the equipment room, where Sarah's gear was laid out on a metal table. Standard civilian contractor equipment on the surface, but she recognized the specialized items hidden among the mundane. Night vision goggles disguised as surveying equipment, a communication device built into what looked like a water purification tablet container, a combat knife that appeared to be a standard utility tool. But it was what wasn't there that concerned her. No body armor, no tactical weapons, no medical kit beyond basic first aid. If this went wrong, she'd be facing trained fighters with little more than her wits and whatever she could improvise. "There's one more thing," Chen said as she checked the equipment. "We've received intelligence that suggests Rodriguez wasn't just investigating weapons. There may be a high-value target at that compound, someone with direct knowledge of the domestic terror plot we discussed." Sarah's hand stilled on the gear. Another convenient coincidence. Another piece of information that made this mission more critical, more urgent, more likely to push her into taking risks she wouldn't normally accept. What kind of target? Above your clearance level, I'm afraid. But if Rodriguez found him, if they're both at that compound, Chen let the implication hang in the air. 2 hours later, Sarah was riding in the passenger seat of a battered Toyota pickup truck, dressed in local clothing with a headscarf that concealed most of her features. Jamal Naziri drove with the casual confidence of someone who'd been navigating these roads his entire life. He was older than she'd expected, maybe 50, with weathered hands and eyes that missed nothing. "You are not a typical contractor," he said in accented English as they left the main road for a dirt track that wound into the hills. "What makes you say that?" Jamal smiled, revealing teeth stained by years of tea and tobacco. "The way you check your equipment, the way you sit in a vehicle. You are a soldier, yes? Special forces." Sarah kept her expression neutral. "I am a consultant." "Yes, of course, and I am a simple driver." His smile widened. "We are both many things, I think." They drove in comfortable silence after that. Sarah used the time to study the landscape, remembering details from her previous operations in this area. The terrain hadn't changed, but the political situation was more complex now. The Taliban had regained significant territory, and foreign fighters from a dozen different countries had established footholds in remote compounds like the one they were approaching. As they climbed higher into the hills, Jamal began sharing intelligence that hadn't been in her briefing. Local fighters had been seen moving toward the compound in unusual numbers over the past week. Supply trucks had been coming and going at all hours, and 3 days ago, just before Rodriguez went dark, a helicopter had landed briefly at the compound, a helicopter that didn't match any known Afghan military or coalition aircraft. "This troubles me," Jamal said. "Usually the compound is quiet, few guards, little activity. Now it is different." Sarah felt the familiar tightening in her chest that came before action. Whatever was happening at that compound, it was bigger than a simple weapons cache investigation. Rodriguez had stumbled into something significant, and now she's walking into the same situation with minimal backup and questionable intelligence. They stopped 2 kilometers from the target, parking the truck in a grove of stunted trees that provided concealment from aerial observation. From here, they would proceed on foot using a route that Jamal had scouted the previous night. "From this point, it is dangerous," he said as they gathered their gear. "Many ways to die in these hills: mines, snipers, wild dogs that eat anything that moves." Sarah checked her weapons one final time. A pistol concealed under her robes, the disguised knife, and a small explosive device that looked like a rock but could blow a hole through a concrete wall. Not much firepower for what they might face, but stealth was more important than overwhelming force for this type of mission. As they began the climb toward the compound, Sarah's radio crackled with a brief transmission from Major Chen. Overwatch reports increased activity at the target site, multiple vehicles, estimated 20 to 30 personnel. Exercise extreme caution. 20 to 30 fighters against her and an aging Afghan guide? The odds were getting worse by the hour. But Rodriguez was up there, possibly alive, possibly in possession of intelligence that could save American lives. And somewhere in that compound might be answers to the questions that had been nagging at her since Harrison's phone call. Sarah adjusted her headscarf and continued climbing. She'd gone into worse situations with longer odds. The key was to stay flexible, stay smart, and never let emotions override tactical judgment, even when the mission was personal. As they crested a ridge that provided their first visual of the compound, Sarah understood why Rodriguez had gone dark. The place was a fortress. High walls, multiple guard towers, and enough armed men visible to suggest this was more than a simple weapons cache. This was a major operation, and Rodriguez had walked right into the middle of it. Now it was her turn. The compound assault lasted exactly 17 minutes. Sarah moved through the darkness like her call sign suggested, a ghost. While Jamal created a diversion at the main gate, she scaled the eastern wall using climbing gear that had been disguised as surveying equipment. The guards were focused on the explosions coming from the vehicle checkpoint, giving her precious seconds to infiltrate undetected. She found Rodriguez in a storage building that had been converted into a makeshift prison. He was alive but badly beaten, chained to a support beam with zip ties that had cut deep grooves into his wrists. When he saw her, his eyes widened in disbelief. "Ghost? What the hell are you doing here?" "Saving your sorry ass," Sarah whispered, cutting his restraints with her disguised knife. "Can you move?" Rodriguez tested his legs, wincing as circulation returned. "I can move, but Sarah, listen, this whole thing is wrong. They were expecting me. They knew exactly who I was and why I was here." Sarah's blood chilled. "What do you mean?" "The moment I approached this compound, they called me by name. Not my cover identity, my real name. They said someone from Washington had told them I was coming." The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. If Rodriguez had been set up, if someone in the intelligence community had fed information to hostile forces, then this entire mission could be a trap designed to eliminate both of them. "We need to move, now." Sarah helped Rodriguez to his feet, scanning the building for weapons or useful intelligence. "What did you find about the domestic terror plot?" "That's just it. There is no plot, at least not the way Harrison described it. These guys are small-time arms dealers. The biggest thing they're planning is selling stolen AK-47s to local militias." The pieces clicked together in Sarah's mind with horrifying clarity. Harrison had lied about the threat level to get her to accept the mission. Rodriguez had been used as bait to draw her back into the field. But why? What did someone in Washington want badly enough to orchestrate this elaborate deception? Before she could voice her suspicions, the building's door exploded inward. Armed fighters poured through the opening, shouting in Arabic and English. Sarah pushed Rodriguez behind a concrete barrier and drew her pistol, but they were outnumbered 10-1. "Surrender now and you live," one of the fighters called out in accented English. "We know who you are, Colonel Mitchell. We know what you did here 8 years ago." 8 years ago! Sarah's final mission in Afghanistan, the operation that had ended her career and forced her into retirement. The mission that was supposed to be classified at the highest levels. "I don't know what you're talking about," Sarah called back, stalling for time while her mind raced through escape options. "Operation Nightfall. You killed Hamza al-Rashid in this very compound. His brother has been waiting a long time for revenge." Operation Nightfall. The mission that had eliminated a terrorist financer but had resulted in civilian casualties when intelligence proved faulty. Sarah had been blamed for the collateral damage, court-martialed in secret, and quietly forced into retirement to avoid an international incident. Now it seemed someone had used that history to lure her back into a trap. The firefight was brief but intense. Sarah's training kicked in automatically. Assess, move, engage, reassess. She put down 3 fighters with precise shots while moving Rodriguez toward a window that offered their best escape route. Jamal's diversionary explosions were growing closer, suggesting he was fighting his way toward their position. But as they reached the window, a sniper's bullet caught Rodriguez in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing into Sarah. They both went down hard, Rodriguez's blood soaking into her robes. "I'm hit," Rodriguez gasped, pressing his hand to the wound. "Not fatal, but I'm losing blood fast." Sarah applied pressure to the wound while scanning for the sniper's position. The shot had come from a building across the compound's central courtyard, a nearly impossible angle that required exceptional skill. "American sniper," Rodriguez said through gritted teeth. "That was a Barrett 50 cal, military precision. These aren't just local fighters, Sarah. Someone sent professionals." The revelation that American operatives might be involved in the trap changed everything. This wasn't just about revenge for Operation Nightfall. Someone in the U.S. intelligence community wanted Sarah and Rodriguez eliminated, and they were using foreign proxies to do it. Jamal's voice crackled through her concealed radio. "Miss Sarah, I have a vehicle ready at the north wall, but there are many fighters between you and the escape route." Sarah looked at Rodriguez's wound, calculating time and distance. He could move, but not quickly.
They'd be exposed crossing the courtyard, and the sniper would have multiple opportunities for clean shots. "There's something else," Rodriguez said, his voice growing weaker. "I found documents in the main building before they captured me. Financial records showing payments from a CIA account to this compound. Someone has been funding these fighters for months." CIA payments to hostile forces? American snipers providing overwatch for foreign fighters? A mission based on fabricated intelligence? Sarah's mind reeled as she tried to process the scope of the conspiracy. The truth hit her with crystalline clarity. Harrison hadn't sent her here to rescue Rodriguez or stop a terrorist plot. He'd sent her here to be killed, along with Rodriguez, to cover up whatever illegal operation had been running through this compound. "We need those documents," Sarah said. "Sarah, no. We need to get out of here alive."
If we don't get proof of what's happening here, they'll just try again, and next time, we might not be so lucky. Sarah helped Rodriguez to a defensive position behind a concrete wall, then began planning their next move. The main building was 50 meters away across open ground. The sniper had excellent fields of fire, and at least a dozen fighters were positioned between their current location and the target. But Sarah had spent 15 years in situations where impossible was just another word for challenge. She used her remaining explosive device to create a smokescreen, then moved through the chaos with the fluid efficiency that had earned her legendary status in special operations. While Rodriguez provided covering fire from their defensive position, Sarah crossed the courtyard in a series of tactical bounds, using debris and abandoned vehicles for concealment. The sniper tracked her movement but couldn't get a clean shot through the smoke and obstacles. Sarah reached the main building and fought her way to Rodriguez's makeshift prison cell, where she found a cache of documents hidden beneath loose floorboards. Financial records, communication logs, operational plans, everything needed to prove that a rogue CIA cell had been running an illegal arms trafficking operation through this compound. Rodriguez's investigation had threatened to expose them, so they'd set up this elaborate elimination scenario. But as Sarah gathered the evidence, she heard helicopters approaching. Not Afghan military or coalition aircraft, the distinctive sound of American Blackhawks coming in fast and low. The cleanup crew was arriving. Sarah had perhaps 3 minutes before overwhelming force surrounded the compound. She grabbed the most crucial documents and began her fighting retreat back to Rodriguez's position. The sniper had repositioned for a better angle, and his next shot missed her head by inches. "We're leaving now," she shouted to Rodriguez as she reached his position. "Did you get it? Enough to destroy careers and send people to prison for life." They fought their way to the north wall, where Jamal waited with their vehicle, a modified pickup truck that had seen better decades. As they climbed aboard, the first Blackhawk appeared over the compound's main building, searchlights cutting through the smoke. "Drive," Sarah shouted, and Jamal gunned the engine. The truck bounced and lurched over rough terrain as they fled into the hills. Behind them, the compound erupted in coordinated explosions as the cleanup crew eliminated evidence of the illegal operation. But Sarah had what she needed. The documents in her pack would expose Harrison's conspiracy and vindicate both her and Rodriguez, if they could survive long enough to deliver them. As they reached the relative safety of the main road, Rodriguez slumped against Sarah's shoulder, his breathing shallow but steady. "So what now?" he asked. Sarah looked at the documents in her hands, then at the distant glow of fires from the compound. "Now we go home and burn down everyone who tried to kill us." The war was far from over. 18 hours after escaping the compound, Sarah sat in a secure briefing room at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, facing a panel of military officials who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. The documents she'd retrieved from Afghanistan were spread across the table, each page stamped with classifications that made several colonels shift uncomfortably in their seats. General Patricia Hawkins, commanding officer of the Army Special Operations Command, reviewed the financial records with the expression of someone watching a train wreck in slow motion. Beside her sat Director James Crawford from the FBI's Counterintelligence Division, a thin man whose poker face couldn't quite hide his fury at what the evidence revealed. "This is a nightmare," General Hawkins said finally, setting down a communication log that detailed payments to Afghan militants. "Harrison's been running an unauthorized black operation for 2 years, using official channels to fund weapons trafficking." Sarah remained silent, letting the evidence speak for itself. Rodriguez sat beside her, his arm in a sling, but his eyes alert. They'd agreed to let the investigation unfold naturally, rather than pushing too hard too fast. Director Crawford pulled up a digital file on his tablet. "We've been tracking unusual financial patterns in Harrison's division for months, but we couldn't connect them to specific operations. This provides the smoking gun we needed." "What's Harrison's current status?" Sarah asked. "In custody as of 3 hours ago," Crawford replied, "along with 6 other operatives who were part of his trafficking network. They're claiming everything was authorized under deep cover protocols, but these documents prove otherwise." General Hawkins leaned back in her chair, studying Sarah with new interest. "Colonel Mitchell, your official record shows you retired 8 years ago after a classified incident in Afghanistan. Are you prepared to return to active duty to help prosecute this case?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah had spent 8 years building a civilian life, carefully constructed an identity that kept her far from the world of military intelligence. But the conspiracy Harrison had built wouldn't be dismantled by halfway measures. "What would that involve?" she asked carefully. "Full reinstatement at your previous rank, with command of a new counterintelligence task force. Your mission would be to identify and eliminate similar corruption within special operations divisions, essentially internal affairs for the intelligence community." Rodriguez shifted in his chair. "General, with respect, Colonel Mitchell has already sacrificed enough for her country. She was forced into retirement because of political considerations." "Which is exactly why she's perfect for this assignment," Crawford interjected. "She has no current loyalties to protect, no career ambitions that could be compromised. She's already proven she'll pursue the truth regardless of personal cost." Sarah looked at the documents scattered across the table, thinking about the fighters in Afghanistan who died because American operatives had turned them into pawns in an illegal operation. She thought about Rodriguez, nearly killed because someone decided he knew too much. She thought about her quiet life in Phoenix, the hardware store, the careful routine she'd built to stay invisible. "I'll need full authority to investigate any personnel, any operation, any department," she said finally. "No restrictions, no political interference." General Hawkins nodded. "You'll have it. We're creating a new division specifically for this task force. You'll report directly to me and Director Crawford, with oversight from the Senate Intelligence Committee." "And my cover identity? Sarah Mitchell, the hardware store clerk?" "Will be maintained as your civilian persona. Your military reinstatement will be classified, known only to essential personnel. You'll operate under deep cover, moving between your civilian life and military assignments as needed." It was a unique arrangement, but Sarah could see the advantages. She could maintain the normalcy she'd built while having the authority to pursue corruption at the highest levels of the intelligence community. "I accept," she said.
3 days later, Sarah found herself in a surreal situation, checking in at Fort Benning, Georgia, for what appeared to be a routine military exercise, but was actually her first assignment as head of the newly formed Internal Security Task Force. Her mission was to investigate reports of corruption in the training division, specifically allegations that drill sergeants were taking bribes to pass unqualified recruits through basic training. It seemed mundane compared to international arms trafficking, but Crawford had explained that corruption often started small before metastasizing into larger conspiracies. Sarah had been given a cover identity as a Pentagon efficiency expert evaluating training protocols. She wore civilian clothes and carried herself with the understated authority of a government bureaucrat. To anyone watching, she looked like exactly what her credentials claimed: a middle-aged woman sent to observe and report on military procedures. The irony wasn't lost on her. After 15 years as one of the military's most decorated special operations commanders, she was now pretending to be a civilian observer watching soldiers train. Staff Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez, no relation to Miguel, was assigned as her escort. He was a career infantry soldier, 22 years of service, with the kind of by-the-book demeanor that suggested he took regulations seriously. "Ma'am, I understand you're here to evaluate our training efficiency," he said as they walked toward the basic training area. "Is there anything specific you'd like to observe?" "I'm particularly interested in assessment procedures," Sarah replied, staying in character. "How you determine whether recruits meet standards for advancement." They approached a group of recruits going through physical fitness evaluations under the supervision of Drill Sergeant Anthony Williams. Williams was a compact man in his 40s with a kind of aggressive energy that made recruits snap to attention when he walked by. But as Sarah watched him work, she noticed something troubling. Williams was clearly favoring certain recruits, giving them extra time on timed exercises, overlooking form violations that would normally result in push-up penalties. Meanwhile, other recruits, mostly those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, received harsh criticism for minor infractions. "Pathetic," Williams shouted at a young woman struggling with pull-ups. "My grandmother could do better than that, and she's been dead for 10 years." The recruit, Sarah noted her name tape read Jackson, was clearly giving maximum effort, but Williams continued his verbal assault. "You don't belong here, Jackson. This is the United States Army, not some weekend fitness class." Sarah felt her professional demeanor slipping. Williams wasn't just being tough. He was being unnecessarily cruel to a recruit who was obviously trying her best. Meanwhile, a male recruit who'd barely completed half the required repetitions received encouragement and a passing grade. "Is this typical behavior?" Sarah asked Staff Sergeant Rodriguez quietly. Rodriguez looked uncomfortable. "Drill Sergeant Williams has his own methods. Results speak for themselves. His units have high graduation rates." High graduation rates achieved through selective enforcement of standards. Sarah was beginning to understand the nature of the corruption she was investigating. As the morning progressed, the pattern became more obvious. Williams had clearly divided the recruits into two categories: those who received preferential treatment and those who were subjected to harassment designed to force them out of the program. The division seemed to correlate with the recruits' family backgrounds and connections rather than their actual performance. During a water break, Sarah overheard Williams talking to another drill sergeant about weekend plans that involved expensive restaurants and sporting events well beyond what a sergeant's salary could typically afford. The conversation was cut short when Williams noticed Sarah listening. "You have something to say, lady?" Williams asked, his tone suggesting he didn't appreciate civilian oversight. Sarah maintained her cover, responding with the mild authority of a bureaucrat rather than the command presence of a colonel. "Just observing the training process, Sergeant Williams. Please continue." But Williams seemed to take her presence as a challenge. For the rest of the morning, his treatment of the struggling recruits became even more harsh, as if he was demonstrating his authority over both the soldiers and their civilian observer. The breaking point came during afternoon combat training. Recruit Jackson, the same young woman Williams had berated earlier, was attempting to qualify on the rifle range. She'd been practicing for weeks, but was having trouble with her accuracy scores. Williams positioned himself directly behind her, shouting criticism that had nothing to do with marksmanship and everything to do with humiliation. "You're worthless, Jackson. Your father wasted his money sending you here. You'll never be a real soldier." Sarah learned later that Jackson's father was a disabled veteran who'd worked 3 jobs to help his daughter achieve her dream of military service. Williams was using that knowledge as a weapon against her. When Jackson missed her final qualifying shot by mere points, Williams declared her a failure. "Pack your bags, soldier. You're going home to Daddy." Jackson stood at attention, tears streaming down her face, but maintained military bearing despite the emotional assault. That's when Sarah Mitchell, hardware store clerk and Pentagon efficiency expert, made a decision that would change everything.
She stepped forward, her posture subtly shifting from civilian observer to something else, something that made every soldier in the vicinity instinctively straighten their spines. "Sergeant Williams," she said, her voice carrying a tone of authority that cut through the afternoon heat like a blade. Drill Sergeant Williams turned to face Sarah with the kind of aggressive confidence that came from 20 years of intimidating recruits. His eyes held the predatory gleam of someone who enjoyed exercising power over those who couldn't fight back. "Something I can help you with, ma'am?" he asked, the honorific dripping with sarcasm. "Or are you just another civilian who thinks she knows how to train soldiers?" Sarah took a measured step closer, close enough that Williams could see the unwavering steel in her eyes. Around them, the other recruits and training staff began to notice the tension building between the drill sergeant and the unassuming woman in civilian clothes. "I've been watching your methods, Sergeant Williams," Sarah said quietly, "and I have concerns about your evaluation standards." Williams laughed, a harsh sound that carried across the training area. "Lady, I've been training soldiers since before you knew what the military was. These kids need to be pushed hard, or they'll get themselves and their buddies killed when they hit real combat." "Is that what you call it, training?" Sarah's voice remained calm, but something in her tone made Staff Sergeant Rodriguez take an unconscious step backward. "You don't know what you're talking about," Williams snapped. "That Jackson girl is weak. She doesn't have what it takes to be a soldier. I'm doing her a favor by washing her out before she gets someone killed." Sarah glanced at Recruit Jackson, who stood frozen at attention, tears still staining her cheeks, but her posture ramrod straight. The young woman had exactly the kind of mental toughness the Army needed. "Her marksmanship scores?" Sarah asked. "Below standard. By how much?" Williams hesitated, sensing a trap but unable to see it clearly. "What does that matter?" he blustered. "It matters because 3 points is well within the statistical margin of error, which means Jackson's performance was essentially at standard. But you're using that microscopic deviation as justification to end her military career." Williams's face reddened. "Listen here, lady. No, you listen." Sarah's voice cut through his bluster like a knife through paper. "I've observed your training methods for 6 hours. In that time, you've shown clear favoritism towards recruits whose families have military connections or political influence, while systematically targeting those from working-class backgrounds."
The training area had gone quiet. Recruits who should have been focusing on their exercises were stealing glances at the confrontation unfolding between the drill sergeant and the mysterious civilian observer. "You don't know anything about training soldiers," Williams said, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "What's your background, lady? What makes you think you can come in here and question my methods?" Sarah smiled, but it was the kind of smile that made combat veterans check their weapons. "My background?" She reached into her jacket and pulled out a leather credential case, holding it so Williams could see the badge inside. But instead of the civilian contractor identification he expected, Williams found himself staring at military credentials that made his blood freeze. "Colonel Sarah Mitchell, United States Army Special Operations Command," Sarah said, her voice carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "And you, Sergeant Williams, are under investigation for corruption, abuse of authority, and violation of equal opportunity regulations." The transformation was immediate and complete. Sarah's posture straightened, her shoulders squared, and suddenly the middle-aged woman in civilian clothes became someone who radiated command presence like heat from a forge. Every soldier in the area instinctively came to attention, including Williams himself. "Ma'am," Williams began, but Sarah cut him off with a gesture. "You'll address me as Colonel Mitchell or ma'am, and you'll speak only when I give you permission." Sarah's voice carried the kind of authority that came from 15 years of commanding elite soldiers in combat zones. "Right now, you're going to stand at attention while I explain exactly how deep in trouble you are." Williams snapped to attention, his face pale beneath his drill sergeant's hat.
For the past 2 years, you've been taking bribes from wealthy families to ensure their children pass basic training regardless of performance, Sarah continued, walking slowly around Williams as she spoke. You've also been systematically harassing recruits from lower socioeconomic backgrounds to force them out of the program, artificially inflating your unit's graduation statistics. Each word hit Williams like a physical blow. He'd been so careful, so subtle in his corruption. How had this woman uncovered his schemes in just one day of observation? The FBI's financial investigation has already identified the payments, Sarah said, answering his unspoken question. What they needed was evidence of the behavior those payments were purchasing, which you've kindly provided through your treatment of recruit Jackson and others. Sarah stopped directly in front of Williams, close enough that he could see the combat ribbons reflected in her eyes. Ribbons that told the story of a soldier who'd seen action in more theaters than most Marines dreamt of. "But here's what really pisses me off, Sergeant," Sarah said, her voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "You're not just stealing money or corrupting the training process. You're destroying the dreams of young Americans who want nothing more than to serve their country. Kids like Jackson, whose father gave his legs for this nation and who worked 3 jobs to give his daughter a chance at the military career he couldn't finish." Williams swallowed hard, sweat beading on his forehead despite the afternoon heat. "Do you know what my call sign was during 15 years of special operations, Sergeant Williams?" Williams shook his head, not trusting his voice. "Ghost," Sarah said softly, "because I had a talent for appearing where my enemies least expected me, and for making problems disappear without a trace. Right now, you're the problem." The silence stretched across the training area like a held breath. Even the wind seemed to have stopped, as if nature itself was waiting to see what would happen next. "Colonel Mitchell," Staff Sergeant Rodriguez said carefully, "what are your orders?" Sarah looked around the training area, taking in the faces of recruits who'd been watching this exchange with growing amazement. These young soldiers had just witnessed something they'd probably never see again: a drill sergeant being taken down by someone with even more authority and infinitely more credibility. "Sergeant Williams will be escorted to the military police for processing. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, you'll assume temporary command of this training unit until a replacement can be assigned. And recruit Jackson." The young woman snapped to attention. "Yes, ma'am. You'll be retaking your marksmanship qualification tomorrow morning under proper supervision and evaluation standards. I have a feeling you'll perform much better without someone undermining your confidence." Jackson's face lit up with hope for the first time all day. "Yes, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am." As military police arrived to escort Williams away, Sarah pulled Staff Sergeant Rodriguez aside. "I want a full review of every recruit in this unit. Anyone who was improperly failed gets a second chance. Anyone who is improperly passed gets additional training until they meet real standards." "Understood, Colonel. What about the other drill sergeants who might be involved in similar corruption?" Sarah smiled, was sharp as a blade. "Leave that to me, Sergeant. I'm just getting started." As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the training ground, Sarah watched recruit Jackson join her fellow soldiers for evening formation. The young woman stood taller now, her confidence returning as she realized she'd been given a second chance to pursue her dreams. But Sarah's work at Fort Benning was far from over. Williams had been just one part of a larger corruption network, and dismantling it would require the same patience and precision she'd used in combat zones around the world. The Ghost was back in action, and this time her mission was cleaning up her own house. 6 months after the confrontation at Fort Benning, Sarah sat in her Phoenix apartment reviewing files from her latest investigation. The morning sun streamed through her kitchen window as she sipped coffee from a mug that read, "World's Okayest Hardware Store Employee," a gag gift from Bill Murphy when she'd returned to her part-time civilian job. Her double life had become surprisingly manageable. 3 days a week, she was Sarah Mitchell, a helpful hardware store clerk who could fix anything and never lost her temper with difficult customers.
The other 4 days, she was Colonel Mitchell, ghost hunter of the military's dark corners, pursuing corruption with the same relentless precision she'd once used to hunt terrorists. The Williams case was just the beginning. Her phone buzzed with an encrypted message from General Hawkins. "Congressional hearing tomorrow. Your testimony will be crucial. Williams' plea deal approved, full cooperation in exchange for reduced sentence." Sarah smiled grimly. Williams's cooperation had blown open a corruption network that stretched across 3 Army bases and involved over 20 personnel. Millions of dollars in bribes, hundreds of unqualified soldiers passed through training, and countless qualified recruits driven out of service by systematic harassment. But the real victory wasn't the prosecutions or the recovered money. It was the letter she'd received last week from Second Lieutenant Amanda Jackson. Sarah pulled the letter from her files, reading it again despite having memorized every word. Jackson had not only passed her requalification, but had graduated at the top of her basic training class. She'd been selected for officer candidate school and was now serving as a platoon leader in Germany. "Colonel Mitchell," the letter read, "I wanted you to know that your intervention changed more than just my military career. It changed how I see myself and what I'm capable of achieving. But more importantly, it showed me what real leadership looks like. Not the kind that tears people down to build itself up, but the kind that lifts others up without seeking credit." Jackson wasn't the only one whose life had been transformed. 37 recruits who'd been improperly dismissed had been given second chances. 28 of them had successfully completed training and are now serving around the world. The other 9 had chosen different paths, but with their confidence restored rather than destroyed.
Sarah's work had also inspired changes in the military's training oversight procedures. New protocols required multiple evaluators for borderline performance cases. Anonymous reporting systems allowed recruits to report abuse without fear of retaliation. And perhaps most importantly, drill sergeants now underwent psychological evaluation and ethics training before assignment. But the impact extended far beyond policy changes. Word of the ghost colonel had spread through military circles like wildfire. Not the operational details, those remained classified, but the story of a mysterious officer who appeared without warning to hold corrupt officials accountable. Junior officers began reporting suspicious behavior in their units, knowing someone was finally listening. Senior officers started policing their own ranks more carefully, aware that someone with unquestioned authority was watching. Sarah's reputation had even reached international allies. British SAS Commander James Hartwell had requested her assistance with a similar corruption investigation in their training programs. The Israeli Mossad had inquired about consulting arrangements. The Australian Defence Force had formally invited her to review their special operations selection process. But it was a letter from an unexpected source that reminded Sarah why her work mattered on a personal level. Marcus Rodriguez, Miguel's cousin and Sarah's escort during the Williams investigation, had written to thank her for restoring his faith in military leadership. His letter revealed that he'd been struggling with depression after witnessing years of corruption and abuse, contemplating leaving the Army despite 22 years of service. "Watching you confront Williams showed me that there are still officers who care more about doing what's right than protecting their careers," Rodriguez had written. "I've decided to stay in uniform and try to be the kind of leader you demonstrated that day." Sarah's phone rang, interrupting her reflections. The caller ID showed Miguel Rodriguez, now fully recovered from his Afghanistan wounds and serving as an instructor at the Army's intelligence school. "Ghost," Miguel said when she answered. "How's the civilian life treating you?" "Can't complain. Fixed 3 broken drill presses and helped a customer pick out the right screws for a deck project yesterday. Very fulfilling." Miguel laughed. "Right, and I'm sure your other job is equally mundane." "I have no idea what you're talking about. I'm just a simple hardware store employee." "A simple hardware store employee who's testifying before Congress tomorrow about military corruption. Sarah, the whole intelligence community is talking about your task force. You're cleaning the house in ways that should have happened years ago."
Sarah walked to her window, looking out at the quiet suburban street where children rode bicycles and neighbors waved to each other. It was the kind of peaceful scene she'd fought to protect during her years in special operations. "Someone had to do it," she said simply. "But it didn't have to be you. You'd earned retirement, earned the right to disappear into civilian life. What made you come back?" Sarah considered the question. The easy answer was Rodriguez's capture, the conspiracy she'd uncovered in Afghanistan. But the real answer was more complex. "Do you remember what you told me when we first met?" she asked. "About how the job changes you, makes it impossible to walk away when people need help." "Yeah. I tried walking away, spent 8 years convincing myself I was done, that I'd given enough. But every morning when I put on civilian clothes and pretended to be normal, I knew it was a lie. This is who I am, Miguel. This is what I do." And the hardware store? Keeps me grounded, reminds me what normal people need from their military. Protection, not predation. When I help a veteran fix his garage door opener, or when I see a Gold Star mother trying to repair something her son would have handled, it reminds me why we wear the uniform. They talked for another few minutes before Sarah had to leave for work. As she walked to Murphy's Tools and More, she reflected on how strange her life had become. She was arguably one of the most powerful people in the military, with authority to investigate anyone at any level. Yet 3 times a week, she still stocked shelves and mixed paint for customers who knew her only as helpful Sarah. At the store, Bill Murphy was training a new employee, a young veteran named David Chen, no relation to the major from Afghanistan, who'd been struggling to find work after his discharge. From the Marines. "Mitchell," Murphy called out, "show Chen how to operate the key-cutting machine. Kid's all thumbs." Sarah spent the morning teaching Chen the intricacies of hardware retail, watching his confidence grow as he mastered each new task. By lunch, he was handling customers on his own, his military bearing perfectly suited for the customer service demands of construction contractors. During her break, Sarah received a text from an unknown number. "Colonel Mitchell, this is Amanda Jackson. I'm home on leave and would love to buy you coffee if you have time. I'm getting married next month and wanted to invite you to the wedding." Sarah smiled, typing back her acceptance. Jackson's wedding would be attended by dozens of soldiers whose lives had been changed by the events at Fort Benning. Not just those who'd been given second chances, but those who'd witnessed what real leadership looked like under pressure. As she returned to work, Sarah thought about legacy. Not the kind written in official records or carved on monuments, but the kind that lived in the actions of people she'd inspired. Every ethical decision made by an officer who remembered her example. Every recruit who refused to quit because they'd heard about the colonel who fought corruption. Every drill sergeant who chose encouragement over harassment because they knew someone was watching. That evening, Sarah prepared for her congressional testimony, reviewing the evidence that would put the final nail in the Williams corruption network. But she also received a call that would shape her next mission. "Colonel Mitchell, this is General Patricia Stone, commanding officer of the Marine Corps Training Command. We have a situation at Paris Island that requires your particular expertise. Are you available for consultation?" Sarah looked around her simple apartment, at the life she'd built between 2 worlds. Tomorrow, she would testify before Congress as a decorated colonel fighting military corruption. Next week, she would return to mixing paint and answering questions about socket sets. In between, she would investigate new corruption, protect new victims, and continue the work that had become her true calling. "General Stone," Sarah said, "I'm always available to serve." As she ended the call, Sarah realized something profound. She was no longer pretending to be a simple woman with a secret military past. She was finally comfortable being exactly who she was, a warrior who chose when and where to fight, guided by principles rather than politics, answerable to her conscience rather than her career. The ghost would always be ready when duty called. And somewhere in Germany, Second Lieutenant Amanda Jackson was leading her soldiers with the same quiet strength she'd learned from watching a colonel take down a corrupt drill sergeant with nothing but truth and unshakable moral authority.
The legacy would endure long after Sarah Mitchell returned to anonymity, living on in every leader who chose courage over convenience, and in every soldier who remembered that true strength protects those who cannot protect themselves. In the end, that was enough. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.